Hello, my name is Micah, and today I'm going to be discussing some of the components that we learned throughout biomechanics throughout the term and how that affects high jumping. So, one of the components that I thought would have a little more impact that ended up, spoiler, not having as much of an impact was the knee joint angle at the time of planting, touchdown, and toe off when the jumper is pushing off that toe, and also the max flexion angle of the knee joint. So I found a couple articles to kind of dive into that a little bit, but I also used some of my own application from the class to go into it a little bit further at the end of it if you want to stick around for that. So here's a dive into the knee joint angle and the maximum height jumped by each high jumper. So just to give a little bit of background, the Fosbury flop was one of the more effective high jumping techniques that was kind of the only improvement really from the scissor jump. So as I said, the previous method was the scissor jump before the Fosbury flop, and the Fosbury flop was introduced in 1968 Olympics by Dick Fosbury right here. And this jump has 4 different phases to it. It has a run-up phase where the high jumper is kind of angled into the run and they do a half circular motion. The preparation where they're planting their foot, and then the takeoff where they're pushing from that planted foot, and then the clearance over the bar. And I just saw a good explanation of the movement, which was a double arm swing from a large backward lean of the body, and then at takeoff, foot touchdown. So if that didn't help you at all, here's a little video of what that looks like. And so that's going to be the Fosbury flop. This is kind of what we're talking about the entire time, but I also have a video of the scissor jump, or yeah, scissor jump on the next slide too, just so you're not missing out on anything. Oops, there we go. So just to put it into perspective, some of the previous world records for high jump, because it's kind of hard to tell how high you can jump, but the 1912 record, so one of the first Olympics, was 2 meters flat, and that's about 6.5 feet. And then in the 1993 Olympic Games, which is where the world record was set, it was 2.45 meters at 8 foot and a quarter inches. And then at the 05 World Championships, it was 2.27 was the winning jump at 7 feet 5.3 inches. And then at 07 World Championships, 2.35, which I look at this article specifically a lot, so that's the one I'll kind of be referencing to a couple times. And then also the 09 Thessaloniki, it's not a World Championships, but it is a European, it's a big European track meet, so not quite at the world's level or Olympic level, but still a very valid athletic event. And then this is where they examine women high jumpers. Oh, and here's a video of the scissor jump. Kind of a sporadic, random little attempts compared to the Fosbury flop. Here it is again. There's not much consistency to it. They're kind of just try to get over the bar, but they still do a pretty good job even without good technique or physics involved. A little bit of physics. Alright, so some of the variables that I'll be looking at and some of the measurement tools that are used. It's pretty simple. The dependent variable is the max jump height, so we're looking how high they can clear the bar with their body. And indirectly, I found that the vertical velocity was very important for this dependent variable. The independent variable, so the one that we'll be looking at for that changes not based on the dependent, is the knee joint angle, so this angle right here. And the indirect variable that I found was that tangential velocity due to the center of mass movement is actually pretty important here for the high jump itself, and the correlation between these two have a bigger impact on the height of the high jump. But I'll get into that a little bit later after I get through all the knee joint angle stuff. So some of the measurement tools used were just high-speed cameras and then something like a motion tracking app, so like Canovia like we did in class, and you're able to kind of analyze the knee joint angle by placing markers on the body, and people were able to do this by setting up multiple ones around the high jump pit. And so I'll kind of go into that a little bit later with each of the cameras that were used. So the first article that I looked at was the challenge in the men's high jump, a brief report on biomechanical analysis of the techniques for top 3 men high jumpers in the IAAF World Championships in Athletics, Osaka 2007. So the participants in this study were 3 male world championship high jumpers. They didn't know that they were participating in the study, so that probably didn't play too much of an effect on their psychology. They were in front of the entire world though, so that does play an effect on their psychology. Some of the equipment used were, like I said, high-speed video cameras. It doesn't go into depth on what kind of software they used, but they used two 250 hertz cameras and then two 60 hertz cameras. And the measurements of knee flexion at this time were 161 for toe down, 170, and 151 for each of these. And it is ranked from top to bottom, first, second, and third. So the maximum flexion of the knee was also measured, and the flexion of when the toe is pushing off the ground. And these are interesting, but I won't go into the conclusion yet. They kind of all have the same conclusion, which I guess is good for the studies. It's very consistent. But I was thinking that the difference between the maximum flexion, so when the knee is most bent, to the toe off, when the toe is pushing off, would have an indicator, if anything, of how high the person would jump. The next article was a 3D biomechanical analysis of women's high jump technique, and the participants were 7 elite women high jumpers in that European track meet that I was talking about earlier, but that's not a world championship or an Olympic game, but still high level. And the equipment used were 3 high-speed cameras of 50 hertz. And so I just took the top 4 participants. I didn't want to make an entire list of the 7 just because you can get a good spread of the top 4. But as you see here, maximum flexion, some of these people got into a little bit deeper of a flexion and it didn't really matter based on the results, whereas in the last slide, the person who won, he had the most flexion and he won, but this person had the least flexion and she still won. So that is interesting to note, but it doesn't make too much of an impact on the final height jump. The third article I looked at was biomechanical analysis of the high jump at the 2005 IAAF World Championships in Athletics. And they looked at the 13 male World Championship high jumpers. These were all finalists. The equipment used were high-speed cameras. One was 200 hertz and 2 were 50 hertz. And they were kind of angled in a triangular fashion. So there was one here, one here, one here if the high jump pit was all the way in the center. And I took the top 4 participants, but as you see here, the maximum flexion didn't have too much of an impact on placing. And this person almost flexed as much as this person, but they scored very differently. And one thing that I would like to note about this study is it had a very good quote where it said that high knee joint stiffness is crucial for the speed floppers, those who come in with more velocity, who probably store more elastic energy in their muscle tendon complex than power floppers, who takeoff is based on concentric muscle action. So they're saying that having a stiffer knee joint for the people who come in faster is likely more to positively impact the height that they attain. So in conclusion, were the studies consistent? Yes, they were. They all kind of said that knee joint angle doesn't matter too much based on the dependent outcome, so the jump height. The jump height was independent of the difference between the maximum knee flexion and toe off flexion, which I talked about earlier. So I thought that the difference between those would have a bigger impact, and it really didn't. It was all over the place between first and fourth, or first and third, first and second. Was the equipment sufficient? Yes, it was. They managed to use high-speed cameras that were able to track the amount of frames that they needed per recording, and so they were able to properly use their Biomechanics angle tracking app. And I did end up finding that there was a component that had a way bigger impact, but I'll kind of go into that after this whole slide and dive in a little deeper. So this concludes my main portion of does knee flexion affect jump height. I kind of wanted to get through that just so that I stuck to my initial research and was trying to figure out what happened there. But now I'm going to go into a little bit deeper of what I think actually happens on high jump and the math behind that all. Okay, so this is kind of just the after hours of what I found out based on my research on high jumping, and this was super interesting to me. It's kind of one of the first biomechanics rabbit holes that I went down, and I just wanted to share it with you just in case you wanted to use this in class or if you were interested yourself. But I did find out the actual factors of what were impacting the high jump height more. So the truth is that all winners had both the highest vertical velocity and one of the highest vertical displacements of center of mass throughout their jump, and I'll explain that a little more. So I think that the highest vertical velocity, so the vertical velocity is resembled by the tangential velocity, and I used some of the information that we just learned in class, the Vs equals angular velocity times radius, so this little diagram right here, the butterfly, and what we saw is that runners or jumpers who were running towards the high jump pit, they were leaning in towards the center. And so when they were doing that, I think what happened is that if here's a beforehand and here's an after the lean, but I think it moved their center of mass, and this is exaggerated, but from here to here. And so they were able to, since tangential velocity, which I think translates to vertical velocity, is equal to angular velocity, which I don't think changes too much, but the radius changes. And so if this increases, then this tangential velocity going up should increase. And so as you're moving from S1 you're not leaning in at all, to S2 you're leaning in a little bit, then you're covering this entire distance in the same amount of time as this one, but you're moving a lot further. So what that's going to do is increase your tangential velocity, and I kind of wrote down tangential velocity acts as vertical velocity, so that's what I think the correlation is after the horizontal velocity is translated into angular velocity. So there is a twist involved with the knee as well, but as the runner's coming in, they lean in a little bit, and then with that twisting of the knee, they're able to take all this velocity that was going this way and then twist it upwards over the bar. So two of the things that I found was that with a greater velocity due to the center of mass movement, so that lean in that I was talking about, which is displayed as the internal lean, the tangential velocity would also increase even if this angular velocity, this W or omega, stays the same. Therefore, an increase in both of these factors leads to the higher jump, but I think that the vertical displacement of center of mass leads to a higher vertical velocity. And one of the other things that I found was that this guy, Rybakov, he was in both the 2005 and 2007 World Championship observations, and so I looked at his horizontal velocity coming into it on toe down, and then his horizontal velocity coming out of it on toe off, and I set those as V final and V initial. So I found out that there was a lost velocity, something that kind of disappeared in between this toe down and this toe off in the horizontal direction. And what's interesting is that this lost velocity, quote unquote lost, because what I think happens is it's translated as the rotational velocity into upward movement. And so the lost velocity is lower on the one that he did poorer at, and it's higher on the one that he did better at. And so this may lead to a vertical velocity at toe off that is higher at the area that he did higher at, because of the lost velocity of horizontal velocity is turned into his vertical velocity. So that's pretty much everything. I kind of got into a really deep rabbit hole last night and when I was finishing this up, and it was super intriguing. I think maybe you'd enjoy this too, but if not, then I don't know, at least you got to hear a little bit of my spiel. But there is one more slide that I have. Oh, it's the sources, so I'll just skip to that real quick. And here are my sources, just wanted to include these so you know that they exist. Yeah, I did use these little numbers to denominate the reference that I was making in each slide, so there's that as well.